My parents disrespected my baby and called me names during family dinner. My man told me to just ignore it all, so I couldn't take it anymore and left. Then days later, I moved far away without telling anyone, and what I did next was really bad for them. Hey everyone, my name is Jessica, and I'm 29 years old. Up until 7 months ago, I genuinely believed I had what most people would consider a pretty normal, stable life. I'd been married to my husband Tyler for 6 years, and we had built what seemed like a solid foundation together. We had one son, Lucas, who had just turned 6 years old and was the absolute light of my life. Tyler's parents, Linda and Frank, lived about 30 minutes away from us, which felt like the perfect distance, close enough for regular family visits, but far enough that we maintained our independence as a family. We had fallen into this routine of doing the whole extended family dinner thing every couple of weeks, usually at their house. It seemed like a normal, healthy family tradition at the time. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I completely missed or chose to ignore. Linda had always been what I generously called particular about things. She was one of those women who possessed very strong opinions about how absolutely everything should be done, and she certainly wasn't shy about sharing those opinions with anyone within earshot. She'd make these little passive-aggressive comments about my cooking, questioning whether I was seasoning things properly or if I was using the right techniques. She'd critique my housekeeping, suggesting that maybe I should vacuum more often or that my organization system wasn't quite up to her standards. She even had opinions about how I dressed Lucas, implying that his clothes weren't always appropriate or that I wasn't putting enough thought into his appearance. None of it was ever anything horrible or overtly cruel, but it was constant and persistent. It was just enough to make me feel like I was perpetually being evaluated and graded on a report card that I had never signed up for in the first place. Every interaction left me feeling slightly inadequate, like I was failing some invisible test that only she knew the parameters for. Frank, Tyler's father, was quieter than Linda, but he had this particular way of looking at you that made my skin crawl. It was like you were something unpleasant that he'd accidentally scraped off the bottom of his shoe and couldn't quite figure out how to dispose of properly. He'd worked in plumbing his entire adult life and had developed that old-school mentality where showing any kind of emotion or vulnerability was a sign of weakness. He seemed to view any display of feeling with contempt and disdain. Tyler always defended his father's behavior, saying that Frank was just from a different generation and that I shouldn't take his coldness personally. This was basically code for, please don't make me deal with this uncomfortable situation or force me to choose sides. Tyler himself, and I want to be clear that I loved that man deeply for 6 years, was what you might call a peacekeeper. On the surface, that sounds like an admirable quality, and in many situations it was. But I've since learned that sometimes keeping the peace means throwing the people you're supposed to protect directly under the bus when things get difficult. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, and I want to tell you about the specific dinner that changed absolutely everything about my life and my perspective on family relationships. It was a Saturday in early April when everything fell apart. We had driven over to Linda and Frank's house for what we thought would be our usual family dinner. Lucas had been absolutely excited all week long because Linda always made these amazing oatmeal raisin cookies whenever we visited. I have to admit, they were actually pretty incredible. She had some kind of secret recipe that made them perfectly chewy with just the right amount of sweetness. Lucas had been talking about those cookies nonstop for days, asking me repeatedly when we were going to Grandma's house and if she would remember to make them. We arrived at their house around 5 p.m. and everything seemed completely normal at first. The familiar routine unfolded exactly as it always did. Linda had prepared meatloaf for dinner, which was actually one of her better dishes. She had a way with the seasoning that I grudgingly had to respect. Frank was positioned in his usual spot directly in front of the television, half watching some baseball game while nursing what I suspected wasn't his first beer of the evening. The moment we walked through the front door, Tyler immediately disappeared into the living room to join his father, leaving me to help Linda in the kitchen as always. The trouble started almost immediately, the moment Tyler was safely out of earshot. Linda looked at Lucas with that critical eye of hers and declared, "Lucas looks thin. Are you feeding him enough?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. I forced myself to bite my tongue and managed what I hoped passed for a polite smile. "He's growing just fine, Linda," I replied, keeping my voice as even as possible. "The pediatrician says he's right on track for his age and height." I thought mentioning medical professional approval would end the conversation, but I was wrong. "Doctors these days don't know anything," she muttered dismissively. then shoved a stack of plates into my hands with more force than necessary. "Set the table and make sure Lucas doesn't touch anything expensive," she added, as if my 6-year-old was some kind of destructive force that needed to be contained. The expensive comment was particularly rich, considering their dining room set looked like something they'd picked up at a garage sale sometime in 1985. The chairs didn't match, the table had visible water rings from years of neglect, and the whole setup had seen much better days. But I kept my mouth shut, set the table as requested, and called everyone in for dinner, hoping we could get through the meal without any major incidents. This is where things started going sideways in a way I never could have anticipated. Lucas was in one of his chatty, excited moods, enthusiastically telling his grandparents about what he'd been learning at school and sharing stories about his friends. He was gesturing animatedly with his hands, the way kids do when they're really passionate about something they're explaining, completely absorbed in his storytelling. That's when disaster struck. Lucas knocked over his glass of orange juice while he was talking. It wasn't even a big deal. The glass was plastic because Linda wasn't completely stupid about having breakable items around children, and it was maybe half full at most. The juice spilled across the table and started dripping onto the floor, creating a small orange puddle that would have been easily cleaned up with a paper towel. Lucas's face immediately turned bright red, and he started apologizing profusely. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," he said, his voice already shaky with the fear of having done something wrong. I was already reaching for napkins to clean up the spill when Linda completely lost her mind. She grabbed Lucas's arm, his left arm, right above the elbow, and twisted it hard enough that I actually heard him gasp in pain and shock. "You stupid little mistake," she hissed through clenched teeth, her voice dripping with venom. "Can't you do anything right? Just like your mother, making messes everywhere you go." I was on my feet before I even realized I had moved. Something primal and protective kicked in the moment I saw her hurting my child. "Linda, let go of him right now," I said, my voice sharp and commanding in a way that surprised even me. She looked at me like I had grown a second head right there at the dinner table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with indignation and disbelief that I would dare challenge her authority in her own home. "Let go of my son," I repeated, this time with even more force behind the words. Lucas was crying now, desperately trying to pull his arm away from her grip while she continued to dig her fingers into his skin. I could see him struggling, and it was breaking my heart. I reached over and grabbed her wrist firmly. "Let go," I said again, making it clear that this wasn't a request anymore. It was a demand. She finally released Lucas's arm, and he immediately ran to me, clutching his injured arm against his chest and sobbing. I could see the angry red marks where her fingers had been digging into his skin. They were already starting to darken, and I knew they were going to turn into proper bruises. The sight of those marks on my baby's arm filled me with a rage I had never experienced before in my life. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I demanded, pulling Lucas protectively behind me while keeping my eyes locked on Linda. My voice was shaking with anger and adrenaline. "Don't you dare use that tone with me in my own house," Linda snapped back, her face flushed red with anger and embarrassment at being called out. "That child needs discipline. He's running wild because you're too soft on him. He needs to learn consequences for his actions." Tyler finally looked up from his plate, where he had apparently been trying very hard to pretend that nothing was happening. "Mom, maybe—" He started weakly, but I wasn't about to let him minimize what had just occurred. "Maybe nothing," I interrupted, my voice rising. "She hurt him, Tyler. Look at his arm. Actually, look at what she did to our son." Tyler glanced over at Lucas, who was still crying and holding his arm, then looked back at his mother with obvious discomfort. It was clear he didn't want to deal with this situation at all. "Mom, you probably shouldn't have—" he began, but Frank's voice cut through the room like a knife before Tyler could finish his half-hearted attempt at intervention. "Shouldn't have what?" Frank demanded, his voice cold and threatening. He had been quiet up until this point, but apparently he had decided it was time to join the confrontation. Shouldn't have taught the boy some manners? Shouldn't have tried to instill some discipline in him? "There's a difference between teaching manners and hurting a child," I said, trying desperately to keep my voice steady and controlled, despite the fact that I was shaking with anger. What she did was abuse, not discipline. Frank stood up slowly from his chair, and I could immediately smell the beer on his breath. It was clear he had been drinking heavily before dinner, which wasn't exactly unusual for him, but it made the situation even more volatile and unpredictable. "That boy is soft because you're raising him like a girl," Frank said, his words slightly slurred, but his intent crystal clear. A little discipline never hurt anyone. In my day, children knew how to behave because there were real consequences for acting up. Discipline? I was fighting so hard not to completely lose my composure. She called him a mistake and twisted his arm hard enough to leave bruises. That's not discipline. That's abuse, plain and simple. Well, maybe if you'd raised him right, he wouldn't be so clumsy, Frank said, taking a deliberate step toward us. His posture was threatening, and I instinctively moved to shield Lucas more completely. Maybe if you taught him how to act properly, we wouldn't have these problems. That's when Lucas, still crying and trying to wipe his tears, looked up at his grandfather with those innocent 6-year-old eyes. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he said, his voice small and broken. "I didn't mean to spill it. I'll be more careful next time, I promise." And Frank, this 70-year-old man who was supposed to love and protect his grandson, looked down at my 6-year-old son and spit directly in his face. "You're exactly like your worthless mother," Frank said with pure venom in his voice. "Nothing but trouble from the moment you walk through that door." I have never experienced rage like that before in my entire life. It was like someone had injected molten lava directly into my bloodstream, and every nerve ending in my body was on fire. The sight of my innocent 6-year-old son standing there with his grandfather's spit running down his cheek while he sobbed was something that will be burned into my memory forever. I immediately grabbed Lucas, who was now sobbing uncontrollably and trying to wipe the spit off his face with his sleeve. I started backing toward the door, keeping my body between my son and these people who had just shown me exactly who they really were, underneath their facade of respectability. "Tyler," I said, my voice shaking with a combination of rage, disbelief, and desperation. "We're leaving right now. Get your keys, get your jacket, and let's go." I watched Tyler look between me and his parents, and I could literally see him calculating in his head. This was his moment, his opportunity to choose between his wife and son or his abusive parents. This was when he could prove that he was the man and father I had believed him to be for 6 years. "Jessica, come on," he said, and my heart sank as I heard the tone in his voice. "They're just old school. You know how they are. Dad didn't mean it like that. He's had a few drinks and you know how he gets when he's been drinking. Let's just calm down and let it go," he continued, as if what had just happened was some minor disagreement that could be smoothed over with a little patience and understanding. "Let it go?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Your father just spit on our son's face and called him worthless, and you want me to let it go? Your mother twisted his arm hard enough to leave bruises and called him a mistake, and you think I should just calm down and pretend it didn't happen?" "He's been drinking," Tyler said again, as if alcohol was some kind of magical excuse that could make child abuse acceptable. "You know how he gets when he's had a few beers. He doesn't really mean the things he says." I stared at my husband, this man I had been married to for 6 years, this man who was supposed to be my partner in protecting our child. And I realized that he was actually asking me to let it go while our son stood there with his grandfather's spit still dripping down his face. "No," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the fact that my entire world was crumbling around me. "We're done here. We're leaving, and we're never coming back." I grabbed my purse and Lucas's jacket from the coat rack and headed straight for the door. Tyler called after me, his voice taking on a note of panic as he realized I was serious, but I didn't stop walking. Linda was yelling something behind us about how I was being dramatic and oversensitive, and how I'd better not even think about keeping Lucas away from them because they had rights as grandparents. I got Lucas buckled into his car seat, and he was still crying, still frantically trying to wipe his face clean. I handed him a pack of tissues from my purse and tried desperately to keep my own tears from falling because I needed to be strong for him right now. "Mommy, why did Grandpa spit on me?" he asked, his voice small and confused and completely heartbroken. I didn't have an answer for that question. How do you explain to a 6-year-old child that sometimes adults are just cruel for no good reason? How do you tell your baby that the people who are supposed to love him unconditionally had just shown him the ugliest side of human nature? "I don't know, baby," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But it's not okay, and it's never going to happen again. I promise you that." Tyler came running out of the house as I was starting the car engine. He tapped on my window, and against my better judgment, I rolled it down to hear what he had to say. "Jessica, please," he said, his voice pleading. "Let's just talk about this like adults. Don't do anything rash that we'll all regret later." "Talk about what, Tyler?" I asked, my voice completely flat. "Talk about how your parents just abused our son, and you did absolutely nothing to stop it? Talk about how your father spit in a child's face and you made excuses for him? Talk about how you chose them over us when it mattered most? They're family, he said, as if those two words explained everything and justified what had just happened. So are we, I replied. Or at least we're supposed to be. I drove home in complete silence, except for Lucas's occasional sniffles coming from the back seat. The weight of what had just happened was settling over me like a heavy blanket, and I was trying to process the fact that my entire world had just shifted on its axis in the span of about 20 minutes. When we finally got home, I immediately took pictures of the bruises on Lucas's arm. I didn't really know why I was doing it at the time. It just seemed like something important that I should document. Some instinct was telling me that this evidence might be crucial later, though I couldn't have articulated exactly why. That night, after I had gotten Lucas calmed down, given him a warm bath, and tucked him safely into bed, I sat alone on my couch and really looked at my life. I mean, really, truly examined it with complete honesty for the first time in years. How many times had Linda made cruel, cutting comments about me directly in front of Lucas? How many times had she undermined my parenting decisions or made me feel inadequate as a mother while my son watched? How many times had Frank been drunk and belligerent during family gatherings, creating an atmosphere of tension and hostility that my child had to endure? And most importantly, how many times had Tyler chosen the path of least resistance instead of standing up for us? How many times had he asked me to just let things go, to keep the peace, to not rock the boat, while his parents systematically chipped away at my confidence and made my son feel unwelcome and unloved? I had been making excuses for them for years, telling myself things like, that's just how they are, and they're from a different generation, and family is family. You have to accept them as they are. But sitting there in the quiet of my living room, with my son sleeping peacefully upstairs, I realized that those excuses were complete bullshit. Family doesn't spit on children. Family doesn't call 6-year-olds mistakes. Family doesn't twist little arms hard enough to leave bruises. And family sure as hell doesn't tell you to let it go when someone hurts your child right in front of you. I stayed up all night thinking, analyzing, and planning. By the time the sun started to rise, I had made a decision that would have seemed completely impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to leave. Not just the house. I was going to leave the entire state and start over somewhere completely new. Now, before you think I'm some kind of impulsive person who makes major life-changing decisions overnight without any thought or preparation, let me explain the practical side of this situation. I work as a marketing coordinator, and I've always been extremely careful and conservative with money. I had a savings account that Tyler didn't know about, not because I was hiding it from him or being deceptive, but because I had opened it using my maiden name before we got married, and had simply never closed it or changed the name on the account. For years, I had been putting a little money into that account every month, telling myself it was for emergencies or unexpected expenses. Well, this certainly felt like the definition of an emergency. I had enough saved up to cover moving expenses, first month's rent and security deposit on a new apartment, and living expenses for several months while I looked for a new job. I also had my sister Victoria, who lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We had been extremely close growing up, but life had gotten in the way as we became adults, and we mostly just texted each other on birthdays and holidays. But I knew deep down that she would help me if I asked her to. She had been through her own messy divorce a few years back, and had always told me that I could count on her if I ever needed anything, no matter what the circumstances were. So on Tuesday morning, after Tyler had left for work and Lucas was safely at school, I picked up my phone and called Victoria. My hands were shaking as I dialed her number, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Jessica, what's wrong?" she said the moment she heard my voice. "You sound absolutely terrible." I told her everything. The dinner, the abuse, the spitting incident, Tyler's complete failure to protect his own son, all of it. She listened without interrupting once, and when I finally finished talking, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Pack your stuff," she said finally, her voice firm and decisive. "Both of you, come to Minneapolis immediately. You can stay with me for as long as you need to," she continued. "I don't care if it's 6 months or 2 years. You and Lucas are welcome here." "Victoria, I can't just impose on you like that," I started to protest, but she cut me off immediately. "Yes, you absolutely can," she said firmly. "I have a spare bedroom that's just sitting empty, and Lucas can start school here if he needs to. My company is always looking for good marketing people, and I know people in the industry who could help you find work. You don't have to figure everything out right now, but you need to get out of there as soon as possible." I was crying by then, overwhelmed by her immediate and unconditional support. "What about Tyler?" I asked, even though I think I already knew the answer. "What about him?" she replied bluntly. "He made his choice yesterday when he told you to let it go after watching his parents abuse his son. Now you're making yours." She was absolutely right. I had been so focused on trying to make my marriage work, on keeping everyone happy and maintaining some kind of peace in the family, that I had completely forgotten that I had choices too. I had agency in this situation, and I didn't have to continue subjecting my son to people who clearly didn't respect or care about his well-being. I spent the rest of Tuesday making concrete plans and taking action. I called Lucas's school and told them he would be out for a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. I called my job and used some of the vacation time I'd been saving up, buying myself at least a week to figure things out. I spent hours online researching apartments in Minneapolis, looking at school districts, and finding a few rental properties that looked promising and fell within my budget. But here's where my story takes an interesting turn, because I wasn't just running away from a bad situation. I was angry, furious actually, and I wanted Linda and Frank to understand that actions have consequences. I wanted them to learn that you can't just abuse people and expect life to continue on as normal. See, Linda worked part-time at a local insurance office, one of those small family-owned places where everyone knows everyone and reputation matters enormously. She wasn't licensed to sell insurance or anything like that. She just answered phones, filed paperwork, and handled basic administrative tasks. But she was incredibly proud of that job and constantly talked about how important and indispensable she was to the office, how they couldn't function without her organizational skills. Frank had been retired for 7 years, but he still did odd jobs for people around the neighborhood. It was mostly word-of-mouth stuff, fixing leaky faucets, installing light fixtures, basic handyman work. He was actually pretty skilled at it, and it gave him some extra spending money on top of his Social Security benefits. He took a lot of pride in his reputation as someone who could fix anything and get the job done right. I spent Tuesday evening doing some research, and what I discovered was very interesting indeed. Linda's insurance office had a pretty active social media presence. They regularly posted about their services, their licensed agents, community events they sponsored, all that typical small business marketing stuff. And Linda was always bragging to anyone who would listen about being their office supervisor and how she'd been there for 18 years, building relationships and maintaining client files. The problem was, she wasn't actually the office supervisor. That was someone else entirely. And she hadn't been there for 18 years. She'd been there for 8 years. I knew this because I'd heard her talking about when she started the job, and Tyler had mentioned several times that she'd gotten the position after his father retired. Frank's odd jobs were mostly cash transactions under the table, which was perfectly fine for small residential work. But I had overheard him talking to Tyler about some bigger projects he'd been doing lately. Apparently, he had been doing substantial work for a local construction company, installing fixtures, doing minor electrical work, plumbing repairs, that kind of thing. The kind of work that probably should have been reported as income for tax purposes, especially when you're simultaneously collecting Social Security benefits. Now, I want to be clear that I wasn't planning to do anything illegal or unethical, but I'm a marketing coordinator, which means I understand how paperwork works, and I know how to find information that's publicly available. I also understand how important reputation and credibility are in small communities. Wednesday morning, I started packing systematically. I made detailed lists of everything I was taking, took photographs of our belongings, and kept receipts for everything. I was extremely careful to only pack things that were clearly mine or Lucas's. I wasn't taking anything that belonged to Tyler, or that we had purchased together for the household. But I was taking everything that was rightfully ours. Clothes, personal items, Lucas's toys and books, my work materials, everything we would need to start fresh. While I was in the middle of packing, Tyler called from work. "Hey," he said, and I could immediately hear the guilt and uncertainty in his voice. "How's Lucas doing today? Is he feeling better?" "He's fine," I said curtly. "No thanks to your parents." "Jessica, I know you're upset about what happened, but—" He started, and I could already tell where this conversation was heading. "I'm not upset, Tyler," I interrupted. "I'm done. There's a difference." There was a long pause on his end. "What do you mean, done?" "I mean, I'm done pretending that what happened Sunday was okay or acceptable in any way. I'm done making excuses for people who hurt our son. I'm done being married to someone who won't protect his own family when it matters most." "That's not fair," Tyler said defensively. "You know I love you and Lucas more than anything in the world." "Do I?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you love keeping the peace and avoiding conflict more than you love us. It looks like you're more concerned with not rocking the boat than you are with your son's safety and well-being. Can we please just talk about this face to face when I get home? He asked, his voice taking on a pleading quality. Sure, I said. We can talk. But deep down, I knew there really wasn't anything left to say. The time for talking had passed the moment he told me to let it go while our son stood there with spit on his face. Tyler came home early that afternoon, probably hoping to catch me in a better mood or maybe thinking he could talk me out of whatever I was planning. Instead, he found me in our bedroom, methodically folding Lucas's clothes into a large suitcase, organizing everything carefully by type and season. "What are you doing?" he asked, though I think he already knew the answer from the look on his face. "Packing," I said without bothering to look up from what I was doing. "Jessica, come on," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that I had grown to hate. "You can't be serious about this." I stopped folding and looked at him directly, really looked at him. "Your father spit on our son's face, Tyler. He called him worthless. Your mother twisted his arm hard enough to leave bruises and called him a mistake. And when I asked you to defend him, you told me to let it go." "I know it sounds bad when you put it like that," Tyler said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "It sounds bad because it is bad," I replied firmly. "There's no other way to put it. There's no sugarcoating what happened or making it seem less serious than it was." Tyler sat down heavily on the edge of our bed, watching me continue to pack. "Where are you going to go?" he asked quietly. "That's not really your concern anymore," I said, folding one of Lucas's favorite t-shirts. "Of course it's my concern," he protested. "You're my wife, Lucas is my son. I have a right to know where you're taking him." "Then act like it," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Stand up to your parents. Tell them what they did was completely wrong and unacceptable. Tell them that it will never happen again. Cut them off until they apologize sincerely and get some professional help for their anger and control issues." Tyler was quiet for a long time, and I could see him struggling with the decision. Finally, he said, "I can't do that, Jessica. They're my parents. I can't just cut them off." "And Lucas is your son," I said. "But apparently that doesn't matter as much to you." I finished packing Lucas's clothes and moved on to my own belongings. Tyler sat there watching me, occasionally making half-hearted attempts to talk me out of leaving, but his heart really wasn't in it. I think deep down he knew that our marriage was over, and had been for a while. This incident had just forced us both to confront the reality of our situation. Lucas came home from school around 3:30, and I could see the confusion and concern on his face when he saw the suitcases lined up by the front door. "Are we going on a trip, Mommy?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Something like that, sweetie," I said, kneeling down to his level. "We're going to go visit Aunt Victoria in Minneapolis for a while. Remember Aunt Victoria? She's excited to see us." "What about Daddy?" Lucas asked, glancing over at Tyler, who was standing in the doorway looking completely lost and defeated. "Daddy's going to stay here, but we'll talk to him on the phone, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady and reassuring. "This is just something we need to do right now." Lucas nodded, but I could see that he didn't really understand what was happening. How could he? I barely understood it myself. All he knew was that his world was being turned upside down, and the adults who were supposed to provide stability and security were making decisions that he couldn't comprehend. We left early Thursday morning. I had managed to fit everything we absolutely needed into my Honda Accord, and it was amazing how little we actually required when you stripped away all the non-essential stuff. Tyler stood in our driveway watching us drive away, and I felt this strange sense of emptiness. Not sadness exactly, but like I was leaving behind a life that had never really fit me properly anyway. The drive to Minneapolis took about 14 hours with stops for gas, food, and bathroom breaks. Lucas was an absolute trooper throughout the entire journey. We played car games, listened to his favorite music, and stopped at a McDonald's with a play area so he could burn off some energy and run around for a while. Every time he asked when we were going home, I told him that we were going to stay with Aunt Victoria for a while and see how we liked living in a new place. I tried to make it sound like an adventure rather than an escape, though I'm not sure how convincing I was. Victoria was waiting for us when we pulled into her driveway Thursday evening. She had taken the entire day off work, stocked her refrigerator with kid-friendly food, and had even set up the spare bedroom with bunk beds that she had borrowed from a friend who had children. "Uncle Victoria!" Lucas shouted, running directly into her arms the moment he got out of the car. He had been calling her Uncle Victoria since he was about 2 years old, when he couldn't understand why some people were aunts and some were uncles. She had never bothered to correct him, and it had become their special thing. "Hey there, buddy," she said, picking him up and spinning him around. Are you ready for a big adventure in a new city? That first week in Minneapolis was incredibly difficult. Lucas kept asking when we were going home, and I kept having to explain that this was our home now, at least for the foreseeable future. Tyler called every single day, begging me to come back and promising that things would be different, that we could work everything out if I would just give him another chance. But he never once said that his parents were wrong. He never once said that he would cut them off or set firm boundaries. It was always vague promises like, we'll work it out, and they'll come around eventually, and things will get better with time. But I was done waiting for people to come around. I was done hoping that things would magically get better without anyone actually doing the hard work to change. By the second week, I had managed to find a job. Victoria's company really was looking for a marketing coordinator, and my experience and qualifications were exactly what they needed for the position. The interview process went smoothly, and I was scheduled to start the following Monday. Having that job lined up gave me a sense of stability and hope that maybe we really could build a new life here. I had also found a lawyer during that second week. Her name was Jennifer Martinez, and she specialized in family law. She came highly recommended from several sources, and after meeting with her, I could see why. She was tough, intelligent, and had absolutely zero patience for nonsense or manipulation. She listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like she truly understood the gravity of the situation. "Tell me about the incident," she said during our initial consultation, pulling out a legal pad and preparing to take detailed notes. I told her everything that had happened that night. The spilled juice, Linda twisting Lucas's arm, the verbal abuse, Frank spitting on my son's face, Tyler's complete failure to protect his child. I showed her the photographs I had taken of Lucas's bruises, and I explained Tyler's refusal to stand up to his parents or set any kind of boundaries. "Do you want full custody?" she asked directly, looking at me over her reading glasses. I thought about it for a moment. "I want to protect my son," I said finally. "If that means full custody, then yes, that's what I want. Given the documented abuse and your husband's failure to protect the child, I think we have a very strong case," Jennifer said, making notes on her pad. "But you should know that this is going to get ugly. In-laws don't usually take kindly to being completely cut off from their grandchildren, and they're likely to escalate their behavior." She was absolutely right about that, though I had no idea at the time just how ugly things were going to get. The paperwork was filed on a Friday, exactly 3 weeks after we had left Nevada. Tyler was served with divorce papers at his workplace, which I felt a little bad about, but not bad enough to change my mind about how we handled it. He called me that evening, and he was absolutely furious. "You filed for divorce without even trying to work things out," he demanded, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it before. "We haven't even been to counseling or tried mediation or anything." "I tried to work things out for 6 years, Tyler," I replied calmly. "I'm tired of being the only one putting in effort to fix our problems." "And you're asking for full custody," he continued, his voice rising even higher. "That's completely unreasonable and vindictive. What's unreasonable is expecting me to share custody with someone who won't protect our son from abuse," I said. "What's unreasonable is thinking that I should hand Lucas over to you for weekends when I know you'll take him straight to your parents' house." "My parents aren't abusive, they're just old school," Tyler said, falling back on the same tired excuse he'd been using for years. "Yeah, you keep saying that," I replied. "But old school doesn't excuse spitting on children or calling them worthless mistakes." The conversation went downhill rapidly from there. Tyler accused me of being vindictive and using Lucas as a weapon to hurt him. He said I was overreacting to everything and that I had always been too sensitive about his parents' behavior. I listened to him rant for about 10 minutes before I finally hung up on him. But Tyler's reaction was absolutely nothing compared to what happened when Linda and Frank found out about the divorce proceedings. They showed up at Victoria's house on a Tuesday evening, about a week after Tyler had been served with the papers. I have no idea how they got Victoria's address. Tyler denied giving it to them later, but I can't imagine how else they would have found us. Victoria answered the door, took one look at them standing on her front porch, and immediately called for me. I could hear Linda's voice from where I was sitting in the living room, and it was already shrill with anger. "Jessica!" Linda was practically screaming. "You get out here right now! You have no right to keep Lucas away from us! He's our grandson, and we love him!" I came to the door with Lucas right behind me. He had been playing with some Legos in the living room, but as soon as he heard Linda's voice, he had run to me and grabbed onto my leg, clearly frightened by the angry tone. "You need to leave," I said through the screen door, keeping my voice as calm and controlled as possible. This is private property, and you're not welcome here. That's our grandson, Frank bellowed from behind Linda, his face already red with anger. You can't just take him away from his family. We have rights. I can, and I did, I said firmly. You lost the right to see him when you abused him. You lost that privilege when you chose to hurt a child instead of loving him. We didn't abuse anyone, Linda shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that was probably audible to the neighbors. We were trying to teach him some manners. We were trying to give him the discipline you're obviously not providing. By spitting on him? I asked incredulously. Frank's face was getting redder by the minute, and I could see a vein pulsing visibly in his forehead. You little witch. You don't know what you're messing with, he said, his voice low and threatening. We'll see about this. We're going to fight you on this, and we're going to win. Yes, you will see about it, I said calmly. In court, with lawyers and a judge who will look at the evidence of what you did to my son. They finally left, but not before Frank kicked Victoria's mailbox hard enough to leave a significant dent in it. The next morning, Victoria discovered that someone had put sugar in her car's gas tank, which required an expensive repair and a police report. That same afternoon, someone called Child Protective Services and filed a report claiming that I was neglecting Lucas and keeping him in unsafe, unsuitable conditions. The timing was obviously not a coincidence. The CPS worker who came out to investigate was actually really professional and understanding. Her name was Susan, and she could see immediately that Lucas was healthy, happy, and extremely well cared for. He was clean, properly fed, had appropriate clothing, and was clearly thriving in his new environment. The apartment was safe and clean, he had his own bedroom with all his toys and books, and there were no signs whatsoever of neglect or abuse. She still had to complete the full investigation because it's standard protocol, but she was clearly annoyed that someone had wasted her time and resources with what was obviously a false and malicious report. This happens more often than you'd think, she told me as she was finishing up her paperwork. Usually it's an angry ex-spouse or hostile in-laws who are trying to cause trouble and make life difficult for someone they're upset with. Do you have any idea who might have called in this report? She asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. I had a pretty good idea who was responsible, but I didn't want to make direct accusations without concrete proof. What I did have was Jennifer, my lawyer, who was absolutely livid when I called to tell her what had happened. They're escalating their behavior, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. First they show up uninvited at your residence, then they commit acts of vandalism against your sister's property, and now they're filing false reports with government agencies. This is a clear pattern of harassment, and we're going to document every single incident thoroughly. She was absolutely right about the escalation. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda and Frank tried everything they could think of to make my life as miserable as possible. They called my new job and told my boss that I was a child abuser who was on the run from the authorities. They filed multiple complaints with the local police, claiming that I had essentially kidnapped Lucas and was holding him against his will. They even showed up at Lucas's new school one afternoon, demanding to pick him up and claiming there was a family emergency. But here's the thing that Linda and Frank didn't count on. I had learned to document absolutely everything. Every phone call, every incident, every interaction was carefully recorded with dates, times, witness information, and police report numbers when applicable. I was systematically building a comprehensive case against them, and they were helping me do it by being completely unhinged and unable to control their behavior. Tyler, to his credit, did try to get them to back off and stop their harassment campaign. He called me one evening and I could hear the exhaustion and frustration in his voice. Jessica, please, you have to get them to stop this, he said. They're talking about hiring a private investigator to find out where you're working, where Lucas goes to school, everything about your new life. This is getting completely out of control and crazy. I'm not the one making it crazy, Tyler, I replied. I'm not the one calling in false reports or vandalizing property or showing up at schools uninvited. Tell them to leave us alone. I've tried talking to them, he said. They won't listen to me. They think they're fighting for their rights as grandparents. Then cut them off, I said. Tell them that if they don't immediately stop harassing us, you'll never speak to them again. Tell them that their behavior is destroying any chance they might have had of ever seeing Lucas again. There was a long pause on his end of the line. I can't do that, he said finally. Then I guess we don't have anything else to talk about, I replied, and hung up. That phone call made me realize once and for all that Tyler was never going to choose Lucas and me over his parents. He was never going to be the man I needed him to be, or the father that Lucas deserved to have. He would always prioritize avoiding conflict with his parents over protecting his own child. But I was done waiting for him to figure it out and grow a backbone. The real turning point in this entire situation came about 7 weeks after we had moved to Minneapolis. I was at work, going through some quarterly marketing reports and preparing for a client presentation, when I got a phone call from Lucas's school that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Henderson, this is Principal Harper," the voice said. "We've had a serious incident here at the school, and I need you to come in immediately." My heart stopped beating for a moment. "Is Lucas okay?" I asked, already grabbing my purse and keys. "Lucas is perfectly fine," Principal Harper assured me quickly. "But we had 2 adults show up here this afternoon, claiming to be his grandparents. They said they were here to pick him up because there was a family emergency. When we asked for proper identification and tried to verify their story with you, they became very aggressive and hostile with our staff members. We've called the police." I was out the door and driving toward the school before he had even finished talking. When I arrived, Linda and Frank were sitting in the principal's office with 2 police officers, and they both looked absolutely furious at being detained. Lucas was waiting in the nurse's office, and he ran directly to me the moment he saw me walk through the door. "Mommy," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Grandma and Grandpa were here, but they were being really mean to all the teachers and the office ladies." I knelt down to his level and hugged him tightly. "It's okay, baby," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "You're completely safe now." One of the police officers came over to speak with me. Officer Davis, according to his name badge, looked like he'd dealt with this kind of situation before. "Are you Jessica Henderson?" he asked. "Yes, I am." "These individuals claim to be your son's grandparents," he said, gesturing toward Linda and Frank. "They say there's been some kind of custody dispute, and they have the right to pick him up from school." "There has been no custody dispute," I said firmly. "We're in the middle of divorce proceedings, but there has been no custody hearing yet, and no court orders have been issued. These people have absolutely no legal right to my son whatsoever." Officer Davis nodded and made some notes. "They don't have any documentation with them," he said. "No court orders, no custody agreements, nothing official. And they became verbally abusive when the school staff tried to verify their story and follow proper procedures." "What happens now?" I asked. "Well, technically, they haven't committed a crime by coming here," he explained. "But we're going to strongly advise them to leave the premises immediately and not return. If they show up here again after being warned, that would constitute trespassing." Linda must have overheard our conversation because she suddenly spoke up in that shrill voice of hers. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said loudly. "That's our grandson in there, and we have rights as his grandparents." "Actually, ma'am, you don't," Officer Davis said calmly and professionally. "Grandparents don't have automatic visitation rights, especially when there's documented evidence of abuse and a pattern of harassment." "Abuse?" Linda's voice went up about 3 octaves. "We never abused anyone. We would never hurt that child." I pulled out my phone and showed Officer Davis the photographs I had taken of Lucas's bruises. "This is from when she twisted his arm after he accidentally spilled a drink," I explained. And his grandfather spit directly in his face. Officer Davis looked at the photos, then looked back at Linda and Frank with a completely different expression on his face. "I think you folks need to leave now," he said firmly. They left, but not quietly or gracefully. Linda was screaming about how I had poisoned Lucas against them, how I was destroying the family, and how she was going to make sure I paid dearly for keeping her away from her grandson. Frank was quieter, but the look he gave me as they walked away from the school made my skin crawl. It was pure hatred mixed with something that felt like a threat. That evening, Jennifer called me, and I could hear the determination in her voice. "I heard about what happened at the school today," she said. "This ends right now. I'm filing for a restraining order first thing tomorrow morning." "Can we actually do that?" I asked. "I mean, do we have enough evidence?" "Jessica, you've got more than enough," she said confidently. "Attempted kidnapping, systematic harassment, filing false reports with government agencies, property damage. You've documented enough incidents for a restraining order and then some. And here's the best part of this whole situation. Tyler's going to have to make a choice." "What do you mean?" I asked. "He can either publicly support the restraining order against his parents, or he can be included in it as well. He's going to have to pick a side, and he's going to have to do it in front of a judge." The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. I had to take the entire day off work, but it was absolutely worth it to watch Jennifer systematically destroy Linda and Frank's credibility in front of the judge. She had organized everything meticulously. She presented photographs of Lucas's bruises, police reports from all their harassment incidents, complete documentation of the false CPS report, witness statements from Victoria, Lucas's teacher, Principal Harper, and even the CPS worker who had investigated the obviously false report against me. Linda and Frank had decided to represent themselves in court, which turned out to be their first major mistake. Linda spent most of her time crying dramatically and talking about how much she loved Lucas, how she had never meant to hurt him, and how I was keeping him away from his loving grandparents purely out of spite and vindictiveness. Frank mostly just sat there looking angry and resentful, occasionally muttering under his breath about women today and liberal judges who don't understand traditional family values. Tyler showed up to the hearing, but he sat in the very back of the courtroom and didn't say a single word during the entire proceeding. When the judge directly asked him if he supported the restraining order against his parents, he just stared at the floor and remained completely silent. "Your Honor," Jennifer said during her closing argument, "the evidence clearly shows a systematic pattern of escalating harassment and abuse. Mrs. Henderson is not asking to keep her son away from his grandparents out of spite or vindictiveness. She's trying to protect a 6-year-old child from people who have repeatedly demonstrated that they cannot control their behavior around children and who pose a genuine threat to his physical and emotional well-being." The judge agreed completely with our position. Linda and Frank were ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Lucas, me, Victoria, Lucas's school, and my workplace. They were prohibited from contacting us directly or indirectly, including through social media, phone calls, or third parties. The restraining order was good for 1 full year, but could be extended if they violated any of its terms. They violated it just 3 days later. I was grocery shopping with Lucas at a large supermarket when I spotted Frank's distinctive pickup truck in the parking lot. By this point, I had memorized his license plate number. Another thing Jennifer had taught me to do for documentation purposes. I immediately called the police from inside the store and waited with Lucas in the customer service area. Officer Davis showed up about 10 minutes later. Apparently, he had been dealing with Linda and Frank frequently enough that he recognized the address when the call came in. "Where's the truck?" he asked when he found us. I pointed through the large front windows. Frank was sitting in the driver's seat of his pickup, clearly watching the store entrance and waiting for us to come out. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," Officer Davis said. "I'm going to go have a conversation with Mr. Frank out there. You and your son are going to stay right here inside the store until I give you the all-clear signal." I watched through the window as Officer Davis approached the truck. Frank saw him coming and immediately started his engine, but Officer Davis was faster and more experienced. Within just a few minutes, Frank was out of the truck with his hands behind his back, being placed under arrest. Violating a restraining order is a serious criminal offense, not just a civil matter. Frank spent the night in jail and had to post bail the next morning. The best part of this whole situation was that the bail hearing was part of the public record, which meant it showed up in the local newspaper's court listings the following week. Remember how I mentioned that Linda was extremely proud of her job at the insurance office? Well, it turns out that small insurance companies don't particularly love being associated with employees whose family members are getting arrested for stalking and harassment charges. Linda was fired the following Monday morning. Frank's construction clients weren't too happy about the situation either. Word travels incredibly fast in small towns, and nobody wants to hire someone who's been arrested for violating a restraining order against a child. His reputation as a reliable handyman was completely destroyed practically overnight. But I wasn't finished with them yet. Remember all of Frank's cash under the table work that I had mentioned earlier? Well, the IRS is extremely interested in unreported income, especially when someone is simultaneously collecting Social Security benefits and not reporting additional earnings. Now, I want to be clear that I didn't report Frank to the IRS myself. That would have been petty and vindictive. But I did make sure that all of his social media posts, where he had been bragging about his various jobs and projects, were properly documented and organized. I saved screenshots of posts where he mentioned specific dates, approximate amounts he was being paid, and detailed descriptions of the work he was doing. When the IRS eventually came calling, which they did about 2 months after his arrest, Frank had some very serious explaining to do about his unreported income and potential tax evasion. I found out about the IRS audit from Tyler, who called me in a complete panic. "Jessica, what the hell did you do?" he demanded. "The IRS is auditing my dad's finances going back 3 years. "I didn't do anything, Tyler," I said calmly. "But if your dad hasn't been reporting his income properly, that's between him and the federal government." "You're systematically destroying my family," he said, his voice full of accusation and pain. "I'm protecting mine," I replied. "Your parents chose to escalate this situation at every single turn. They chose to harass us, to violate a restraining order, to try to kidnap Lucas from school. Every consequence they're facing is the direct result of their own actions and choices." Tyler was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to see Lucas." "That's between you and your lawyer," I told him. "Come on, Jessica, he's my son too," Tyler said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "Then you should have acted like his father when it mattered," I replied firmly. The custody hearing was scheduled for late August, about 5 months after we had left Nevada and started our new life in Minneapolis. Tyler had finally hired a lawyer, actually a pretty good one, and was formally requesting joint custody and shared visitation rights. I wasn't entirely opposed to the general idea, despite everything that had happened. Tyler was Lucas's father, and I didn't want to keep them apart forever if there was a way to make it work safely. But I also wasn't going to agree to anything that would put Lucas at risk or expose him to his grandparents' abuse again. My son's safety and well-being were non-negotiable. Jennifer had prepared meticulously for every possible argument that Tyler's lawyer might make. We had comprehensive documentation showing that Tyler had consistently failed to protect Lucas from his parents' abuse. We had clear evidence of his refusal to support the restraining order when given the opportunity. We had detailed testimony from Lucas's new therapist. Yes, I had gotten him into counseling to help him process everything that had happened and work through the trauma. But we also had something else, something I hadn't expected, and that completely broke my heart when I first read it. Lucas had written a letter to the judge with help from his new teacher. It was simple, honest, and absolutely devastating in its innocence. "Dear Judge," the letter read, "I love my daddy, but I don't want to see Grandma and Grandpa anymore because they are mean to me and hurt me. My mommy keeps me safe and I feel happy now. I want to stay with my mommy, but I want to talk to my daddy on the phone sometimes. Can you help us? Love, Lucas." Love. The judge read this letter aloud in open court, and I watched Tyler's lawyer physically wince as the words sank in. There's nothing quite like a child's honest perspective to cut through all the legal maneuvering and adult justifications. In the end, we reached a settlement that I felt was fair, given all the circumstances. Tyler was granted supervised visitation rights, meaning he could see Lucas, but only in a neutral location with a court-appointed supervisor present to ensure Lucas's safety. He was also allowed to call Lucas twice a week at scheduled times that worked around Lucas's school and activities. Most importantly, from my perspective, Linda and Frank were completely and permanently cut off from any contact with Lucas. They would have absolutely no visitation rights, no phone contact, no communication whatsoever, until Lucas turned 18 and could make his own informed decisions about whether he wanted them in his life. Tyler also had to attend mandatory parenting classes and participate in family therapy sessions. If he completed the program successfully and could demonstrate over time that he was willing and able to put Lucas's needs and safety first, we could potentially revisit the custody arrangement in a year and possibly expand his visitation rights. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it felt fair and reasonable given everything that had transpired. The day after the custody hearing was finalized, I got a phone call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I decided to answer it. "You think you've won, don't you?" Linda's voice was shaky with barely controlled rage. "But you haven't won anything. That boy is going to grow up hating you for keeping him away from his family. You've destroyed everything good in this family." "Linda, you're violating the restraining order by calling me," I said calmly. "I don't care anymore," she said, her voice getting louder and more unhinged. "You've destroyed everything. Frank lost his business because of you. I lost my job because of you. Tyler barely talks to us anymore because of what you've done. Are you happy now? Are you satisfied with the damage you've caused?" I thought about her question for a moment. Was I happy? Not exactly. I was profoundly sad that it had come to this point. I was sad that Lucas had to grow up knowing that his grandparents had chosen to hurt him rather than love him. I was sad that my marriage had ended and that our family had been torn apart, but I was also proud of myself. I was proud that I had stood up for my son when it mattered most. I was proud that I had chosen his safety and well-being over keeping the peace and maintaining family harmony. I was proud that I had shown Lucas that he doesn't have to accept being treated badly just because someone shares his DNA. "I'm happy that my son is safe," I told Linda. "I'm happy that he's learning that he doesn't have to accept abuse from anyone, even family members. And I'm happy that he has people in his life who will protect him no matter what the cost. I hung up immediately and called Officer Davis to report the violation of the restraining order. Linda was arrested the next day. Now, 7 months later, I'm sitting in my comfortable new apartment in Minneapolis, watching Lucas play contentedly with his Legos on the living room floor. He's doing so much better than I ever dared to hope. The nightmares that plagued him for weeks after the incident have mostly stopped. He's made wonderful friends at his new school and is excelling academically. He's even joined the soccer team and absolutely loves it. Lucas still talks to Tyler twice a week during their scheduled phone calls, and those conversations are gradually getting easier and more natural. Tyler has actually been doing the hard work that's required of him. He's been attending his therapy sessions regularly, he's completed his parenting classes, and most importantly, he's finally learned to set firm boundaries with his parents. He told me last week during one of our co-parenting check-ins that he hasn't spoken to Linda and Frank in over 3 months, not since Linda's arrest for violating the restraining order. "I finally get it," he said during one of our phone conversations. "I spent so many years trying to keep everyone happy and avoid conflict that I completely forgot who I was supposed to be protecting. I forgot that my first responsibility was to my son. It's far too late for our marriage. Some bridges, once burned, simply can't be rebuilt or crossed again. But maybe it's not too late for Tyler to become the father that Lucas truly deserves to have." Victoria has been absolutely incredible throughout this entire ordeal. She let us stay with her for 4 full months while I got back on my feet financially and emotionally, and she never once complained about the chaos and disruption we brought into her previously peaceful life. Lucas absolutely adores her, and she's become the fun, supportive aunt that every child needs and deserves. My new job has been going exceptionally well. It turns out that getting out of a toxic, stressful situation can be pretty motivating for your career. I've already been promoted once since I started, and my boss has hinted that there might be a management position opening up next year that I'd be perfect for. But the most important thing, the thing that makes all the difficulty and upheaval worth it, is that Lucas feels completely safe again. He laughs more freely than he has in years. He sleeps peacefully through the night without nightmares. And most importantly, he's not constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to hurt him or make him feel like he's done something wrong just by existing. A few weeks ago, Lucas asked me about that terrible night at his grandparents' house. I had been dreading this conversation for months, knowing that eventually he would want to understand what had happened and why our lives had changed so dramatically. "Mommy, why did Grandpa spit on me?" he asked, looking up at me with those innocent eyes that still sometimes break my heart. I had spent a lot of time thinking about how to handle this conversation. I wanted to be honest with him without being unnecessarily cruel or filling him with hatred. "Sometimes people who are hurting inside try to make other people hurt too," I explained carefully. "It doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't excuse what they did, but that's often why people act mean and hurtful." "Are Grandma and Grandpa hurting inside?" he asked, his 6-year-old mind trying to make sense of adult cruelty. "I think so, buddy," I said, "but that's not your job to fix or worry about. Your job is just to be a kid and to know that you're loved and safe." He thought about that for a minute, his little face serious with concentration, then went back to building his Lego castle, as if the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. These past 7 months have taught me a lot about myself that I never knew before. I learned that I'm much stronger than I thought I was. I learned that sometimes being a good mother means making incredibly hard choices that other people won't understand or support. I learned that family isn't just about blood relationships and shared DNA. It's about who shows up for you when things get tough, who has your back when life gets difficult. Most importantly, I learned that my son deserves so much better than adults who make excuses for cruelty and abuse. He deserves to grow up knowing that the people who love him will protect him, not sacrifice his well-being for the sake of family harmony or keeping the peace. Linda and Frank are still dealing with the ongoing consequences of their choices and actions. Frank's IRS audit resulted in a substantial fine and back taxes, plus significant penalties for underreporting his income over multiple years. Linda has been completely unable to find another job in the small town where they live because word travels fast in communities like that, and her association with Frank's arrest and their harassment campaign has made her essentially unemployable. They've had to sell their house and move into a small, cramped apartment. Tyler tells me they blame me for absolutely everything that's happened to them, which honestly isn't surprising. People like Linda and Frank rarely take responsibility for their own choices and actions. It's always someone else's fault when their behavior has consequences. But here's what they fundamentally don't understand. I didn't destroy their family. They did that themselves the moment they decided that hurting a child was acceptable behavior. I just refuse to be complicit in their abuse anymore. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how I handled this entire situation. They think maybe I was too harsh, too vindictive, too extreme in my response. Maybe I should have tried harder to work things out, to find some kind of compromise that would have kept the family together. To those people, I say this. My 6-year-old son had visible bruises on his arm and spit on his face from people who were supposed to love and protect him. My husband, his own father, told me to let it go and keep the peace. What exactly was I supposed to work out? What kind of compromise was I supposed to make? I don't regret protecting my child for one single second. I don't regret demanding that the adults in his life treat him with basic human decency and respect. I don't regret showing him that his safety and well-being matter more than keeping toxic people comfortable and avoiding family drama. Could I have handled some aspects of this situation differently? Maybe. I'm not perfect, and I don't claim to be. But I'm just a mother who loves her child and wasn't willing to sacrifice his physical and emotional well-being for the sake of family harmony and keeping everyone else happy. The restraining order is still in effect for another 5 months. After that expires, Linda and Frank will be legally free to try to contact us again, though they would have to go through the courts if they want any kind of official visitation rights with Lucas. Honestly, I don't think they will even try. They've moved on to blaming me for all their problems and painting themselves as the victims in this situation. People like that rarely have the self-awareness necessary for genuine change, sincere apology, and the hard work of rebuilding trust. But if they do try to come back into our lives at some point in the future, they'll discover that I'm not the same person who used to smile politely and nod and keep the peace at any cost. I'm not the woman who made excuses for people who hurt my child. I'm Lucas's mother, and I will move heaven and earth to keep him safe and protected. That's a promise I made to myself the night I decided to leave Nevada, and it's a promise I intend to keep for the rest of my life. Last week, Lucas brought home a school assignment where he had to write about someone he admires. I was expecting him to choose a superhero, or maybe a sports star, or one of his teachers. But when I read what he had written, my eyes filled with tears, and I had to sit down. I admire my mom because she keeps me safe and she moved us to a new place when people were being mean to me, he had written in his careful 6-year-old handwriting. She is brave and she makes the best grilled cheese sandwiches in the world. She tells me that I never have to let anyone hurt me, even if they are family. My mom is my hero. I have that essay pinned to our refrigerator right next to his latest artwork and his perfect attendance certificate from his new school. It serves as a daily reminder that even when everything else in my life feels uncertain or difficult, I made the right choice when it mattered most. Some days are still challenging. Some days I wonder if there was some other way to handle everything that wouldn't have required blowing up our entire life and starting over from scratch. If there was some magical solution that could have protected Lucas while keeping our family intact. But then I look at my son, really look at him, and I see a child who feels safe and secure in his own skin again. I see a kid who knows that the adults in his life will protect him and stand up for him, not make excuses for people who hurt him. And I know, without any doubt whatsoever, that I made the right choice. People always say that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, and you should always stick by your relatives no matter what they do. But I've learned that the full quote is actually, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." The bonds you choose are stronger than the ones you're born into. Lucas and I chose each other. We chose to build a new life based on love, respect, and safety. Victoria chose to help us when we needed it most, opening her home and her heart to us without hesitation. Tyler is choosing to do the difficult work necessary to become a better father, even though it means confronting some painful truths about his own family. Linda and Frank chose cruelty. They chose pride over love. They chose their own comfort and ego over a child's well-being. They chose to escalate conflict rather than take responsibility for their actions. We all have to live with the consequences of our choices. The difference is that I can sleep peacefully at night, knowing that when my son needed me most, I showed up for him completely. When he was vulnerable and hurt, I protected him. When he needed someone to fight for him, I fought. And at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Update. It's been almost a full year now since we left Nevada and started our new life in Minneapolis. Lucas is doing absolutely amazing. He's getting straight A's in school, has made a wonderful group of friends, and has joined the soccer team where he's discovered he has real talent as a midfielder. His confidence has grown tremendously, and he's become this outgoing, happy kid who lights up every room he enters. Tyler and I are actually co-parenting quite well now that he's completed his therapy and learned how to set healthy boundaries with his parents. We'll never get back together as a couple. Too much has happened and too much trust has been broken for that to ever be possible. But we're building something better than what we had before. A genuine friendship focused entirely on what's best for our son. Linda and Frank tried to contact me through a lawyer about 7 months ago, claiming they wanted to apologize sincerely for their behavior and asking for supervised visitation with Lucas. They said they had learned from their mistakes and were ready to be the grandparents he deserved. My lawyer told their lawyer exactly where they could shove that request. Some bridges, once completely burned, simply cannot be rebuilt. Some trust, once shattered, can never be repaired. The damage they caused wasn't just physical. It was emotional and psychological, and those wounds run deep. But the most important thing, the thing that makes every difficult moment and every hard decision worth it, is that Lucas knows he's loved unconditionally. He knows he's safe and protected. He knows that the people in his life will always choose his well-being over keeping the peace or maintaining family harmony. He's learned that he has value and worth that doesn't depend on other people's approval. He's learned that it's okay to stand up for yourself when someone treats you badly. He's learned that love isn't supposed to hurt, and that family means the people who make you feel safe and valued, not the people who share your DNA. Those are lessons that will serve him well for the rest of his life, and I'm proud that I was able to teach them to him by example rather than just words. Sometimes I think about that terrible night at Linda and Frank's house, and I wonder what would have happened if I had just cleaned up the spilled orange juice, apologized for Lucas being clumsy, and pretended everything was fine. I wonder what would have happened if I had taken Tyler's advice and just let it go. But then I realized that I know exactly what would have happened. Lucas would have learned that his feelings didn't matter. He would have learned that adults could hurt him and there would be no consequences. He would have learned that keeping other people comfortable was more important than his own safety and dignity. He would have grown up thinking that love was supposed to hurt sometimes, and that you had to accept abuse from family members because that's just how families work. Instead, he's growing up knowing that he's worthy of love and respect. He's learning that healthy relationships are built on kindness and mutual care. He's discovering that he has a voice and that people will listen when he uses it. And honestly, that knowledge is worth more than any amount of family harmony or peaceful Sunday dinners could ever be. I've created the life I always wanted for my son. One where he feels safe, valued, and loved for exactly who he is. And that, more than anything else, tells me that I made exactly the right choice when it mattered most.